Gentlemen, we're about to begin the funeral service. We'll start eventually. Before we begin, we ask for those that have a cell phone or pager, if you could turn it to the silent mode. Oh, it's working, okay. We could ask Rabbi Shkop to come up if we could tell him.
Smichtam with David, but it's not open here. אשר האיש אשר לא הלך בעצת ראשונים ודרך חטאים לא יעמד ובמוישב לעצים לא יושב כי אם בתרס אדוני חפצו ובסוירוסו יהגה יומם ולילו והויו כעץ שוסו לה פלגי מים אשר פיריו ייתן בעיתו ועולהו לא ייבויל וכל אשר יעשה יצליח לא יכן הרשעים כי אם כמויץ אשר תדפנו רוח על כן לא יקומו רשעים במשפט וחטאים בעדס צדיקים כי יודע אדוני דרך צדיקים ודרך רשעים תאבד מזמור לדוד אדוני מיוגור בהולכו מישכון בהר קודשךו הולך תומים ופועל צדק ודובר אמס בלבובוי לא ירוגל על לשונו לא יעשו לרעהו רעו וחרפו לא נוסו על קרויבוי נבזה בעיניו נימוס והסירי אדוני יכבד נשבע להורה ולא ימר כספוי לא נוסן בנשך ושויחד על נוקי לא ילוקח אויסה אלה לא ימות לאוילום מזמור לדוד אדוני רוי לא יחסור בינו יסדשי ירביצני על מי מנוחוס ינהלני נפשי ישויבה וינחני במגלי צדק למען שמוי גם כי אלך בגי צלמובס לא ירורו כי עתו ימודי שבטכו ומשענתכו המה ינחמוני תרויך לפני שולחון נגד צוררוי דישנתו בשמן רוישי קויסי רבויו אך טוב וחסד ירדפוני כל ימי חיוי ושבתי בבית אדוני לאורך יומי.
So, we're here to give Kavod Achron to our mother, to Rita Mostofsky, and for the difficult task, the spodla of Livkosa. It's impossible really to convey meaningfully in a few minutes, in few words, how special she was to us and how deeply we loved her. It's been a difficult few weeks, a difficult year, even a few years for our family. And my mother struggled with disease and precipitous declining health and isolation. So soon after the loss of her dear husband, with whom she shared nearly 50 years. And while we find some consolation in the end of her suffering and isolation, we're left devastated and alone. My mother's life spanned countries and many cities and communities before she ended up here in Chicago, and really touched the lives of so many people around the globe, from so many backgrounds and walks of life. For us, she was our singular mother, our home, our anchor. By way of some background, my mother was a single child growing up in an immigrant home with very deep roots. Her Belgian family descended on both sides, from Dayanim, from Rabbanim, from Lachenbach, to Krakow, to Bobov. And her parents, both in Europe and in America, They lived a life of cosmopolitan elegance and refinement, not so much fanciness, but refinement, that my mother absorbed, engaging and navigating the modern world with their inherent ehrlichkeit, tznius, their love of family, and their commitment to Yiddishkeit and to their community. And that was the home that my mother grew up in. She was born on the second Hanukkah Licht in Antwerp in 1939. Soon after, the Nazis came in, and before the horrors really befell in Belgium, my grandfather Sham got out to Toronto to work in the diamond industry in Toronto, and a few years later, my grandmother Sham came with my mother as a little child through Cuba to Toronto, where they were reunited with my father, who had been my grandfather, who'd been preparing things. They stayed in Toronto for a few years, and eventually they moved to the Upper West Side of Manhattan, really for the chinuch of my mother. They moved to the Upper West Side of Manhattan, and there they were surrounded by friends, by family, and by an extended community of ex-Belgians, especially surrounded around Kehilas Mauria, where Rabban Soloveitchik was the Rav for many years. So my mother grew up in New York, and after finishing City College, she worked in Israel for a few years, and before returning to the U.S., and while she was back in New York, she married my father, Al-Shom, came to Boston and established our home in Boston, while continuing to care for her parents who stayed back in New York, with whom we were always very close and going back and forth. And the home that she built in Boston became an institution in the community, and for me and my sister, it was a loving cocoon that my mother really crafted and tended to and presided over. About 5.5 years ago, in declining health, my parents came to Chicago to live near us, leaving behind many dear friends on the East Coast and making many new ones here in Chicago. Their life here was very different than their life back in Boston. But in truth, they came with their values, with their commitment, and they continued their lives, their unique lives here in Chicago. Our maternal Yerusha, our Torah Simacha, is one that's very real. It's very much of this world, but has profound Kedusha. And my mother, Al-Sham, was perhaps understated and reserved, but her impact was immense. We grew up knowing that her love, care, and concern was first and foremost for me and my sister. But we also came to appreciate how generously she shared her friendship with others. She loved people. She loved their stories. You know, any shtick leben, she enjoyed the human drama. And people, in turn, trusted her with their life stories and valued her friendship and valued her insight. She loved her friends, she was dedicated to her friends, and cared for them in very considerate and meaningful ways. She was always following up and checking in and seeing what she could do in thoughtful ways. Pia Pascha b'chachma, there was a lot of chachma. There was a lot of chachma. And a lot of intelligence and savvy and consideration. Everything was done with careful consideration. I was thinking also, Pia Pascha b'chachma, she knew when to open her mouth and when not to open her mouth. And she was very careful about what she said and what she didn't say, or who she said what she wanted to say to. But it was with great sensitivity, chachma, and consideration. And that earned her the great respect and love from friends and family, and from everyone she came into contact with. It could be contractors, it could be vendors, it could be people in the store. People really trusted her and connected with her in ways that I couldn't have imagined. And the Torah's chesed, the chesed was how she lived. It was her life more than what she was actively doing. She joked that when people called her Rebbetzin Mastovsky, she said, "That's my mother-in-law. I'm not Rebbetzin Mastovsky." Okay, that may have been what she said, but in fact, she took care of people. She took care of us, but she took care of everyone else. A focal point of our home were the Shabbos meals. Before the Shabbos dishes had been put away from one meal, from one Shabbos, there was already talk about what was going to come next to the next Shabbos. The plans were underway for the next Shabbos, following up on the conversation, who needed a follow-up call, who needed to meet for coffee, who needed a little bit of extra chizuk, who was going to be invited for the next week, the shopping, the preparation. It was from one Shabbos to the next Shabbos. And my mother, Allah Shem, became somewhat of a maternal figure for decades worth of graduate students and people who passed through Boston of all different ages and all different backgrounds. Not everyone here is so familiar with Boston. I see a few old-time Bostonians here. Boston is a funny community. You have a lot of graduate students, a lot of transients coming through for a couple of years. And there were a lot of people who would come to my parents' home, and for the 2 years that they were there, the 4 years or the 6 years, they were coming all the time. And they would come, feel incredibly close, and then they would move on and build their own lives. There were young parents, there were those struggling to become parents, there were newlyweds and newly divorced, there were almanas, yesomim, and all types in between. I continue to meet people that I can hardly remember that fondly recall my parents' table as a formative experience, spiritually, socially, emotionally, during important parts of their lives. And again, ages didn't matter. My parents, it's hard to describe, but in their home, the young people who came, the old people who came, they were their friends, they were like my parents' siblings, they were like their children, as if I had siblings that I didn't know. I came home once in the summer from yeshiva, and after the Ashkama minyan, went back to the main minyan to pick up the guests. And I came back with a woman, I don't know who she is. She opens the front door by herself, and she says, "Mom, Dad, I'm home." I didn't know who she was. But for those few years, these people felt incredibly close to my parents. And it was done with a lot of intentionality. The invitations were intentional, who to invite, how to help them, following up, keeping track, what they needed, who should sit next to whom, who should come with whom. It was very thought out. We had our regulars and our newbies. We had the fun people, the quiet people. We sometimes had the odd people. As a child, I was always interested in who was going to make for the most lebedik meal. But my mother's cheshbon was really more in terms of the people who were coming and what they needed. And the Shabbos meal was where people came. And the Shabbos was Shabbosdik. And my mother brought with her her elegance and her propriety and the joy. And first and foremost, the Cha and Shabbos, and always, was me and my sister. The experience for me and my sister, and the chinuch for me and my sister, always first and foremost. And honestly, the guests gave us a lot. It contributed a lot to us and to our lives. And there were many guests that we had who didn't enjoy a childhood like we had, didn't enjoy a loving home like we had, who didn't enjoy parents, who didn't enjoy from parents, who didn't enjoy a healthy family situation. And for them, for many of them, and it's only something you came to appreciate much later, those Shabbos meals weren't just a meal, it wasn't just a good time, it was deeply impactful for them. And in subsequent years, they went on to build their own homes and raise their own children and their own families and their own lives. And a number of them have come to me and told me how much those 2 years back in the 80s meant for them in terms of how they decided that they wanted to build their home. People who said, I didn't come from a frum background. I wasn't from when I first came to your parents' home. But I saw you can be normal, you can be fun, and you can be frum. So let's give it a shot. And they did it. There's Hasidic families that are singing my grandmother Lasham's Belgian tune for Sher Hamalos because back in the 80s, that's what they heard. So that's what they heard. So that's how they built their home. In retrospect, she and my father's dynamic was perfectly coordinated. Their personalities paired and were complementary. My father, Oliver Shalom, his outward personality and persona may have been very grand, but he took direction from my mother's insight and consideration. While my father, Osham, was running the meal in the dining room, regaling the guests in riveting conversation, managing all the interactions, my mother, Osham, oversaw the conversation in the adjacent kitchen. And I remember when I was young, so I decide which conversation I wanted to be more in on. So duck into the kitchen, duck into the dining room, duck into the kitchen, see where the juicier conversation was. And after the meal, you had your leftovers. You had the people who didn't leave right away, and sometimes they had other things they needed to get off their chest, and other things they needed to share. Tsaras that they needed to deal with, advice that they wanted, chizuk. So they would hang out in the kitchen after the meal also. And I came to appreciate later what my mother, Elishon, was actually doing and what that meant. The past couple of years in Chicago, we benefited from my parents sharing their sense of home and Shabbos and hosting with us. And while my mother's housing became progressively less established, especially over the past year, And in some ways, in terms of her dignity, it wasn't what she deserved. She took her values with her, her humanity, her insight, the sensitivity, her deep humanity. And it was just amazing to see the meaningful connections that she created even this past year with clinicians and caregivers, residents, patients, the community, and even in these settings where it wasn't her home and it wasn't her table and she wasn't in the state that she wanted to be in, she was still connecting with people on such a deep and meaningful level in ways that they appreciated. For me and my sister, for our family, she only strengthened her love. And she may not have been packing lunches for our lunch boxes before dawn or fixing our clothes, but she never ceased till the very end to care deeply for us, to make sure we were taken care of, to worry about us, and in her own special, insightful way to make sure we were taken care of, to love us deeply, and to show her deep values and continue to teach us. On behalf of the family, I just want to thank the people who were so supportive of her and of us, especially during this past period. The amazing community, the families, the caregivers, doctors, nurses, therapists, so many people who really gave so much of themselves with respect and with love. She really appreciated what you did and who you are and how you gave, and we continue to appreciate it. My sister Benyamina was incredibly close with my mother. Regardless of where they may have been physically, they were always very close. There were many years when I was learning in New York. There were some tough years. My sister really gave so much of herself with love and dedication, not only to keep them going physically, but to continue to give them the dignity and respect that they lived off of. You've always been present, always in touch, always on top of things, always fully engaged. Mommy was so proud of you and loves you so much, and I can't say enough about what you've done for Mommy and Daddy. My wife, Yifat, my mother loved you so much, and you loved her. And you selflessly built our home and our family around them, around caring for them, their comfort, and their respect. We started having more and more guests because they enjoyed it, and we had guests, and suddenly what I thought was only a Boston phenomenon, where you have odds and ends bouncing around, suddenly you realize that we live in a community, and there are individuals, and there are people, and their families, and their homes. There were families and homes that took us in ways that we didn't have in Boston, because we were living in our home, and my parents were able to continue to give because of the home that you built. And in so doing, Mirza Hashem, we can raise our children to appreciate and hopefully continue those values. Half of the family we ask Mechila. We hope we did everything possible for your physical needs, for your comfort, for your covet. It's Mechila. Didn't do enough. It's enough covered. Should be a Melis Yosha, good better for the entire family, for the friends, the community.
El Molrachamim Shochein Bamromim Hamatzei Menucha Nechona Al Kanfei Hashchina Malos Kedoshim Utorim Kezohar Horokim Azirim Es Nishmas Rochel Bas Mordechai Uri Shel Holachol Olama Bavur Sheno Devim Tzokab Ad Haskaras Nishmaso Began Eden Tehenish Menuchasa Lochein Baal Rachamim Yasireha Beseiser Knafov Liolamim Bitzror Hachayim Es Nishmasa Adonai Hunachalasa V'Sanuach Amishkava B'Shalom V'Nomar Amen.
The kfir will take place tomorrow evening at Har Zaysim, 2 hours after the plane lands in Eretz Yisrael, so it's approximately at 9 p.m., 7 p.m. The family will be sitting Shiva in Eretz Yisrael and in Chicago. All that information is on the service folder that you received when you arrived, or on the website for those that have joined on the Zoom that you joined the Zoom with. All that information is on that Zoom. If we can remain standing as we take the Aron out of the chapel, and once you have left the chapel, the Aron is going to go to the airport, and the family will go back to their Shiva locations.